Hey guys, Arjun here. Today's YouTube video is going to be about data types and operators, so let's get right into it.
In Python, there are several different types of data types, but today we're going to be talking about three specific types, and these are the fundamentals that everybody needs to learn. So remember in my last video where I said that any piece of text needs to be put in quotes? Well, anything that is put in quotes, such as writing hello or writing the number 50, if you put that in quotes, is defined as a string. So for example, let's say we create a variable called paper. Remember in my last video, to define what a variable is, we put an equal to sign and then its value. Let's say that I put its value as pencil. Remember, pencil is a piece of text, so we put it in quotes. Now, this variable called paper is storing a string. From now on, I will refer to a piece of text as a string. The second data type is an integer. An integer is a number. However, an integer does not include fractions or numbers after the decimal point. Let me explain this by creating another variable called number. Let's give this variable number a value of 30. As you can see, I did not put the number 30 in quotes, otherwise it would be a string. See, of course I could put this number in quotes, but in some cases, you do actually want to have this value to be an integer. For now, you may not see the importance of having the number written as an integer versus a string, but I'll get into that later. The final data type that I want to discuss is floats. A float is basically an integer. However, it allows for fractions and numbers after your decimal point. Now you may ask, what is the point of even using integers when you have floats? The reason for this is that floats have a much more extensive range than integers do. And when you are working with big numbers, the impreciseness of using floats can get in the way and be very inaccurate. Let me show you a code. Here, I've set up two variables, a and b. Both have the same value, except one is an integer, the other is a float. Can you tell which is the integer? Well, if you guessed a, then you are correct. Remember, integers do not include fractions or any numbers after the decimal point. Now what I want to show you guys is why integers can be better in some cases, rather than using floats. So, in this code that I've written, all you need to understand is that I'm saying variable a, or the integer, is if you happen to add 1, will it be equal to the original value? So the shell will either print true or false. Basically what this is if I have 5 and I add 1, will this be equal to 5? Obviously this is false, so when I press enter, the shell prints false. By the way, true and false are different types of data types, called booleans. Anyways, let's try using a float now. It's basically the same thing. This number plus 1, will it be equal to the original number? No, of course not. So, the shell should print false. But it prints true. See, this is because the range of the values that floats has is so big, and therefore it is very imprecise. So, that is why using integers when calculating big equations is very important. The second topic that I'm going to teach is arithmetic operators in Python. I'm going to combine this topic with data types after this. So, what are arithmetic operators? Arithmetic operators are just adding, subtracting, multiplication, etc. So in Python, we add, of course, using the plus sign. To subtract, we use the subtraction sign. And to multiply, we don't use the letter x, but instead we use an asterisk. To divide, we use the simple slash sign. And for exponents, you might be used to seeing this sign, but we actually use two asterisks, like this. Now, when we do 5 divided by 2, for example, and press enter, the answer is given by the shell as a float, which, remember, is an integer, but it has numbers after the decimal. There are two more important operators in Python, which can give the answer as an integer. The first is floor division, which is denoted by two slashes. Floor division is basically division, except if there is a remainder, the shell will not print it, and the answer is given as an integer. For example, we did 5 divided by 2 up here, which got us 2.5, or 2 remainder 1. If you did floor division, you'd get 2. The last operation is modulo, which is represented by a percentage sign. Modulo is division, except it shows the remainder instead of the answer. Like when we did 5 divided by 2, floor division would give us 2, and modulo would give us 1. By the way, in my description, I will have a spreadsheet of all the different data types that I've talked about and arithmetic operators, so be sure to check that out. Now what I want to show you guys is another set of operators, which are used to see if something is, for example, greater than or less than something. If you want to check if something is equal to another thing, you put a double equal to sign, like this. Remember though, this is if you're checking if something is equal to another thing. We use a single equal to sign, like this, if we are defining a new variable or changing the value of a variable. If you want to check if something is not equal to something, you put an exclamation mark and then an equal to sign. If you want to check if something is greater than another number, it is the greater than symbol. And less than is the less than symbol. Finally, if you want to check if something is greater than or equal to something, you put a greater than sign and an equal to sign. And for less than and equal, you put a less than sign and an equal to sign. So, let's say you wanted to check if the number 35 is greater than 30. All you have to do is write 35 and then put the correct sign, which is the greater than sign. And then you need to put the number that you are checking that is less than the other number, which is 30. And when we press enter, we get true. We can also do this with variables. Let's say we create a variable called num1 and we set it to have a value of 20. And we create another variable called num2 and we set it to have a value of 19. All we have to do to check if num1 is greater than num2, or the opposite, is by putting a greater than sign. So we put num2 or num1 is greater than num1. And when we press enter, you can see that this is false because 19 is not greater than 20. Now what I want to show you guys is how to go from a float to an integer, or a string to a float. Let's say we have a variable called num, and it has a value of 22.0. What if I need to turn this number into an integer? How would you do it? Well, of course, you could just create a new value of num by creating this new variable called num1 and setting it to have a value of 22. But what if you had multiple variables, or you just had a very big number? Yes, you could copy and paste it, but it's not a very efficient way. So, to do this, we use a data type conversion, which looks like this. The function turns it into an integer. So, we can now write int our parentheses, because this is a function, and then the variable name. This does not actually have to be a variable name. For example, it could be an actual number like 10.0, and it would give us an integer. Remember in my last video when I said that to change the actual value of a variable, you have to put an equal to sign and then put the value? Well, it's sort of the same thing here. We have this variable called num, and in order to actually change this value, we have to put the variable name once again, put our equal to sign, and whatever the value is that we're changing it to. So now, if we press enter, you'll see it still won't print anything because to actually print it, if you also remember in my last video, to print something, we have to put our print function, parentheses, and now we put num, close parentheses, because whatever we open we have to close. And once we press enter, we will see that the value of num has now changed from a float to an integer. Remember, we don't put num in quotations, otherwise when we print this, it would actually give the word num. So, here are the three different types of data conversions. Int, which you already learned, float, which is used to go from a string or an integer to a float, and then string, which is abbreviated to str, and is used to go from an integer or a float to a string. If you started to do these conversions in your free time and tried converting a string to an integer, where the string was a number, that had numbers after the decimal point and you got an error, let me show you how to fix this. For example, let's say you had 30.0 stored as a string. So we'll do this by creating a variable called num, the equal to sign, because we're creating its value, put a quotations, because we're creating its value as a string, and put 30.0. You can see that if we try to convert this variable called num to a integer, it'll show an error. So if we do num is equal to int num, close parentheses, you will see that we will get an error. This is because we are skipping a step of going from a string to a float. See, this value inside of the quotations has a number after the decimal point. So, in order to get this number at this variable to hold an integer, we'll first have to do num is equal to float num. So, now if we print the value of num, we'll see that it is 30.0. Now, we can finally change it to an integer by doing num is equal to int num. And if we print this value, we will see that the value of num has changed from 30.0 as a string to 30.0 as a float to now 30. The reason why we got this error was because we immediately went from a string, which was holding a value of a float, to an integer. This is the only type of data conversion that if you do, will show an error. Let's try doing one last problem. Let's create a variable called num and set it to have a value of 50. What I want you to do is divide this number by 10, put it to the power of 2, turn this number back into an integer, and then create the sentence and print the number, whatever your number is greater than the number 10 by X amount. Can you try doing this? Okay, the first thing we're going to have to do is divide 50 by 10. If you remember, the division operator is a slash. So we'll do num, the variable, divided by 10. But remember, in order to change the value of a variable, you have to actually put the variable name and then put an equal to sign and then the value so that the value of num actually changes. So if I press enter now and print the value of num, you'll see that it's changed from 50 to 5.0. Alright, the next thing we're gonna have to do is square the variable. If you remember, exponents are not denoted by this sign, but actually two asterisks. So, in order to square this number, square basically means to the power of 2. So we're going to have to do num exponent and then 2. Remember, in order to actually change the value, you have to put the variable name, equal to sign, and then its actual value, which is num to the power of 2. So, when we print this, we'll see that the value of num has changed from 50 to 5.0 to 25. Now what we need to do is turn the variable num into an integer. So if you remember your data conversions, to turn something into an integer, we use the data conversion int. So in order to change our value of num, we're going to do num is equal.
Are you serious right now?
Alright, so we're going to change the data type of the variable num by doing num is equal to, because we're changing the value, int, because that is our data conversion, and num, because that is what we were trying to change the data type of. So when we press enter and print num, we'll see that the numbers after the decimal point have been removed because it is now an integer. Alright, so now we have to create the sentence. The number x is greater than 10 by x amount. So we first have to put our print statement because we are asking the shell to print something for us. So we'll write print and then our parentheses. So now I need to write the number x, and x is now num. So we'll write quotations because this is a piece of text, a string. And then we'll put the number. Remember in my last video, I taught you that to connect two strings, you have to use a comma or a plus. So I'll put a comma here. Now I'll put num, because that is what we were trying to say. The number num, which is 25. So now we'll have, if I close the parentheses, the number 25. Try doing this and put print the number and you put plus num, you see that you get this error. This is because num and the number are two different data types. One is a string and the other is an integer. So if you're combining two different data types, you cannot use a plus. So you always have to use a comma. But if you're combining two different strings, then you can use a plus. Alright, now let's write the number num is greater than 10 by x amount. So we'll put our print statement, parentheses because it's a function, quotations, number. We need quotations because this is a string, comma, to connect our variable. So now we have the number x, and now we have to write is greater than 10 by. Remember, to connect to different types of data types, we have to use a comma. So I'll put a comma here, put a quotations, and write is greater than 10, close quotations, because we have whatever we open, we have to close. Put a comma, because we have to write the amount that num, this 25, is greater than 10. So in order to connect this, we'll have to put a comma because we're connecting a string and an integer. And how do we say by x amount? Well, how much is num greater than 10? To do this, we'll have to do subtraction. And if you remember the subtraction symbol, it is this minus sign. So we're going to have to put num minus 10 because it is a difference of the two numbers. So now we have the number 25 is greater than 10. Oh, I forgot by 15. So if we close parentheses and print this, we get the number 25 is greater than 10 by 15. You have now written your first official code with data types and arithmetic operators. So yeah guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Catch you in the next one where I'll be talking about if loops.